Okay, hopefully we're all ready now. Hopefully y'all gave a look to the last lecture on the depression, because stuff for that will be on the final, so make sure you watch it. But for now, we're going to go ahead and jump to the next section, which is America's rise to world leadership, the period from 1933 to 1945. Roosevelt and foreign policy. Now, to start out with, before his assumption of the presidency, FDR was an outspoken internationalist who wanted to work with other nations, but on gaining the presidency, much of his energy was focused on domestic issues. Now, why do you think that is? Well, guys, if you wake up and walk outside of your house and see your neighbor's house is on fire, you want to help put it out, but then when you turn around and get the hose and see that your own house is on fire, that kind of takes precedence. Upon gaining the presidency, much of his energy was focused on domestic issues, like I told you, even though he refused to agree to a global tariff reduction agreement, which would have helped sell more American goods, but it might also have had our goods undercut. Or utilize the dollar to assist in the stabilization of worldwide currencies. Some advances that were agreed to were like the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which was passed in 1934. Basically, it authorized the president to lower tariffs on imports from nations that gave us the most favored nation status, meaning they gave us the lowest imports as well. And utilized the Import-Export Bank, which lent money to foreign governments that wished to buy American goods. And guys, we still use the Import-Export Bank. Indeed, the world's largest dam, the Three Gorges Dam, they needed to borrow the money to build that thing, and also they needed to borrow the money to buy General Electric's hydroelectrical turbines, whose technology is so advanced that basically the Chinese can't see them, and they have to pay for the salaries of GE guys to work on the turbines. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. The good neighbor policy. Well, basically, Roosevelt wanted to build upon the good relations that Hoover had built with Latin America. He promised America would be a good neighbor, representing Latin American views and interests, and not interfering in Latin American affairs. Now, this was tested first in Cuba, where President Gerardo the Butcher Majado stirred up political unrest. He sends Ambassador Sumner Welles to encourage Majado to resign, which Majado does, but the new government of Ramon Grau San Martin was seen as communistic. So Welles encouraged Roosevelt to send in the Marines. Roosevelt, however, supported Frangelista Bautista to overthrow Grau and form a government favorable to the U.S. He did so when we would recognize his government, and he remained in power until he was overthrown in 1959. If you've ever seen Godfather 2, that's the president of Cuba that Fidel Castro basically threw out. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. Basically, the U.S. rejected the policy of interventionism to protect U.S. businesses. Now, this was tested by Mexico's president, Lázaro Cárdenas, who swept in and nationalized the U.S.-owned oil companies. Now, of course, the American businessmen called for war to force a return of the properties. Roosevelt, however, sends Ambassador Josephus Daniels to speak with the Mexican government and deliver a series of harsh dispatches. But Daniels kind of knew the way things worked, and he modified the dispatches to less offensive words and recommend for Roosevelt to accept the nationalization and accept a fair settlement. Roosevelt agrees to it, and in 1941, a settlement was reached, which improved U.S. relations in Latin America. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, is the world at peace? No. You have tensions increasing in both Europe as well as Asia. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor, and after the death of Hindenburg in 1935, he initiated a dictatorship in which he broke openly the Treaty of Versailles by building up the military and promising to create a greater Germany. Well, what did the world think of his brass action? Well, in 1938, he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year for his economic recovery he had done in Germany. Meanwhile, what about Asia? Getting ready to go to the next slide. Japan basically wanted to create a Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and they desperately needed resources, so they seized Manchuria in 1931, basically saying that the Chinese had attacked a Japanese railway bridge when it was the Japanese government itself that planted the explosives. But they used that to go in and take it over. And that co-prosperity sphere would be an area that, according to Japanese political science, Yabe Tiji, he said it was the establishment of a defensive and economic sphere embracing Greater East Asia was Japan's moral duty. This new order would exclude non-Asiatic powers, eschew dependence on Europe and America, foster a new Oriental culture, and avoid imperialistic exploitive control, and embrace the world with morality and see other nations as brothers. Kind of like America during our westward expansion. They had gotten to that point in their nationalism. So you got a bad guy in Europe, you got a bad guy in Asia. What country is in between? Getting ready to go to the next slide. Russia. Now that it was between two expansivist nations, both Germany and Japan, it wanted allies. And in November of 1933, America actually extended diplomatic recognition to the USSR. Now, this impact of us recognizing the USSR prompted protests and a want to a return of America to isolationism. Basically, it believed we were only preparing ourselves for war. Indeed, Senator Gerald Nye said that World War I had been the love child of arms manufacturers, bankers, and war profiteers, the merchants of death. And a Gallup poll in 1935 revealed 67% of all college students believed that our intervention in World War I had been wrong. So tensions are mounting. So Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1935 that prohibited the sale of arms and munitions to any nation at war. They also gave the president the power to warn U.S. citizens that those who sailed on foreign vessels to foreign locations were traveling at their own risks. Well, did this stop the fascist nations of Europe? Getting ready to go to the next slide. No, not really. Basically, Germany and Italy began to expand upon the international status quo. Benito Mussolini's Italian troops attacked the Ethiopian nation on October 3rd, 1935. Why did they attack Ethiopia? Well, basically Mussolini wanted to begin building up his promised return to the Roman Empire. Well, how does Roosevelt react? He announces American neutrality and places an arms embargo on Italy, which of course made very little difference because Italian troops had modern weapons and easily overpowered Haile Selassie's 18th century style soldiers. So Roosevelt then asked for a moral embargo where American merchants would not sell items including coal and oil to Italy. But trade went on as usual. And on May 9th, 1936, Italy annexed Ethiopia. Actually, Mussolini sent 250,000 troops against an untrained army of nearly 1 million men, only about half of which had modern rifles and equipment. The chief obstacle that Mussolini had to face was the rugged terrain that slowed him down in 1935. However, in 1936, with the use of air power and poison gas, he broke their defenses and was able to capture the capital of Addis Ababa. Well, what about the Germans? Well, I haven't forgotten about them. Basically, the Treaty of Versailles was totally violated when Germany invaded the Rhineland, which was a place that was supposed to be free of troops. It was an industrial section of Western Germany that was supposed to be free of troops and fortifications. Well, is the U.S. really concerned? Well, Roosevelt was so concerned, he went on a fishing trip. Meanwhile, you have the Spanish Civil War that breaks out. Basically, Civil War broke out in Spain with one side that supported the government and the Republican forces. The other side was supported by conservatives, the Catholic Church, and it was led by Francisco Franco. Most Americans believed the U.S. should stay out of it. Roosevelt, of course, utilized the Neutrality Act and sold neither side weapons. But, guys, this made little difference as Germany and Italy saw this as an excellent opportunity to test out their new weapons of war and supplied Franco with tanks, planes, and infantry. The only ally of the Republican forces was the USSR. Which helped lead to Franco's victory in March of 1939, beginning a harsh dictatorship that ruled Spain for the next 36 years. And indeed, ghosts of Franco still haunt Spain. Meanwhile, here in America, it's election time. Basically, Roosevelt had kept the U.S. out of most of the escalating tension in Europe, even though when he was questioned, he claimed that the choice of profits over peace, the nation will answer, must answer, we choose peace. He was easily able to defeat Alan Landon. and passed the Neutrality Act of 1937, where all warring nations had to pay cash for all non-war goods and carry them back to their countries on their own ships. Americans couldn't sail on belligerent ships, but it did allow the flexibility for Roosevelt to decide which nations were at war and which goods were non-war goods. Now, of course, our neutrality gets tested. Tension with Asia, with the fighting between China and Japan, was raging. On October 5th, Roosevelt responded by calling upon all nations to quarantine bandit nations. Everybody claps at the good idea, but very little is done. And then, getting ready to go to the next slide, we have the Panay Incident. What's the Panay Incident? That's where basically on December 12th, 1937, the Panay was an American gunboat that was strafed and sunk by the Japanese, killing 2 Americans and wounding 50 others. Roosevelt, of course, is outraged, and he wanted to fight back. But our isolationist fever in America was so strong, indeed 70% of Americans supported having a public referendum before the nation could go to war, that the only thing that Roosevelt could do was to accept an apology from Japan and reparations. Now, you would never think that America would be like that. If one of our naval vessels was assaulted, that would get us up for war. Well, underneath Clinton, the USS Cole was hit by a terror boat and 18 U.S. sailors died, and America accepted an apology. Well, what could we do? It was terrorists. Ready for the next slide? The road to war. Okay, guys, even though we're trying to stay out of it, it's not looking like it's going to happen. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Road to war. In 1939, fighting in China and Spain is raging. Hitler had announced his intentions to join all German lands back together into the German Empire of the Reich. He sends Nazi agents to go out and support / cause trouble with Austria so he can achieve Anschluss or merger with Austria. How do other nations react? Well, they just kind of let it happen. Here you see Eine Volk, ein Reich, one people, one empire. Then, after this, getting ready to go to the next slide, he moves to the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. And it had a lot of German-speaking people that lived there. So he wants to incorporate it back into the Reich. Now, Czechoslovakia had allies in France and England and the Soviet Union. They wanted to resist. So British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is sent to meet with Hitler in Munich in late September. And Hitler says, hey, look, this is all I want. I don't want any more territory. Chamberlain agrees to him taking the Sudeten, and he returns to England claiming he had won peace in our time. And of course, Adolf Hitler wasn't satisfied with just the Sudeten. He took all of Czechoslovakia. Here you can see not everybody is also happy about it. But Chamberlain is praised. Once again, remember that Europe is scared of war. Basically, World War I, they honestly believe was the war to end all wars. Okay, next slide. Now, in his homeland, Hitler was to begin to rid the nation of undesirables. Now, it started out slowly, like with the mentally infirmed, then the elderly. Later on, it would turn into political opposition, homosexuals, gypsies, and finally the Jews. However, at this stage, he was only confiscating Jewish property, forcing them to live in ghettos. Some Jews tried to apply for citizenship to America, but they're rejected because they don't have any property. And some people like to point to this as, oh, America's anti-Semitic. Guys, we're still going through the Depression. We have enough of our own poor. And some Jews, by the way, were let in. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. Meanwhile, the building of German strength. Basically, Hitler also signed an alliance with Italy. It was known as the Pact of Steel. He begins to make demands of Poland for the Polish corridor, which was a little sliver of land that separated Germany from East Prussia. It also gave them access to a water port, Danzig. Now, as the Soviet Union could not get a treaty agreement with England or France, they were more than happy to sign the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on August 23rd, 1939, where basically Germany said, hey, we're not going to attack you, you don't attack us. Which kind of made Russia feel relieved that maybe Adolf Hitler had been placated. And on August 23rd, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. England and France declare war on Germany 2 days later. Now, of course, the Germans get their part and the Soviets get their part. That was part of the Non-Aggression Pact. And basically, World War II has begun with the invasion of Poland. Now, Roosevelt, ready to go to the next slide? Get a little sip of coffee. All right, Roosevelt and American neutrality. There was very little desire in the U.S. to come to the aid of Poland, Britain, or France. Indeed, Fortune magazine in a poll weeks before the invasion of Poland, 54% of Americans believed that no international event would be strong enough to pull in American action. And even though Roosevelt proclaimed neutrality, he told Americans that they didn't have to be neutral in their thoughts. You ready to go to the next slide? A special session of Congress was called, reaffirming our neutrality, preventing loans to warring nations, pulling Americans out of combat zones. But Roosevelt did ask for a change in the cash and carry policy. Basically, according to the Neutrality Act of 1939, it was passed, and now any nations could buy weapons from the U.S. Naval vessels began to enforce a neutrality zone 300 miles off the American coast, where naval vessels of belligerent nations, or nations that were at war, were forbidden and would be sunk. So once again, we're trying to be cool and peaceful. Is everybody else trying to be cool and peaceful? No. Basically, the Soviets invade Finland and incorporate the Baltic republics of like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. In 1940, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway. And on May 10th, excuse me, the German offensive begins against France, circumventing the Maginot Line with an invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands, kind of like World War I, Part 2. On May 26, British and French troops begin their evacuation off Dunkirk, where they barely missed total annihilation. Kind of just like that movie where basically they called any boat in Britain to get over there to help evacuate their soldiers. And guys, if the French troops hadn't sacrificed themselves to make sure that the British got off, even though they had to leave all their equipment, and some of the French as well were able to escape, they suffered heavy losses. And on June 10th, Italian troops invade France from the southeast. And by June 22nd, France surrendered, with the Axis powers now controlling almost all of Central and Western Europe. I talked over that slide, sorry. Okay. Then, what happens in England? Well, what happens in England is they had elections too, and basically Winston Churchill is put into power as the Prime Minister. And he was a guy who, Winston Churchill, had fought in the Boer War. He had escaped from jail. He thought he had a campaign in World War I that would bring a quick end to the war, Gallipoli, that turned out to suffer heavy casualties, which kind of put him in a bad light with people. He warned people about Adolf Hitler continuously. Nobody really believed him, but now he was kind of the right man at the right time. And basically he assured everybody that England would never surrender. And on August 8th, 1940, the German Air Force began a massive bombing campaign, trying to soften things up for Operation Sea Lion, which was going to be an invasion of Britain, Hitler's planned invasion of England. But then one of the bombers on their return, well actually on the flight over, it got damaged, so it needed to lose weight. It was flying over London. It dropped its bombs on the city. The press, of course, reacted as you would expect, a civilian target being reacted to. Hitler thought that this then was going to be the way to win the war, so he stopped the campaign that was being carried on against like the airfields, the machines, everything like that, that was actually very effective, and switched it to where basically they were bombing London. And of course, if you've seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's why Lucy, Edmund, Peter, all of them had to get out of London, is to escape the Blitz. And basically, the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, defended against the German Luftwaffe in an incredibly weakened state, but it prevented German air superiority. And one of the ways they were able to do that is because during peacetime, they installed radar towers all along their coast with the English Channel. Okay, getting ready to change it. Well, guys, England was in a world of hurt. So basically, Roosevelt promised them 50 decommissioned destroyers. He convinced Congress to utilize the military budget, placed orders for the production of 50,000 airplanes a year, ordered the National Guard units to active duty. 90% of Americans want us to stay out of the war, but 70% supported giving England destroyers, and 60% want to support England even if it meant getting us into war. The Burke-Wadsworth Act, or America's first peacetime draft, was passed. We gave England the 50 decommissioned destroyers for 99-year leases on military bases in places like Newfoundland, the Caribbean, and British Guiana. Which, of course, like I said, 70% of Americans actually supported that. And by the end of it all, Congress had approved more than $37 billion for military spending, more than the entire cost of World War I. And so Roosevelt is able to easily win the 1940 elections. Oh, only one problem though. That's his third term. Guys, every other president before FDR had only served 2. That's what everybody thought you were supposed to do. Okay, you guys ready? I'm ready to go to the next slide. The battle for the Atlantic. Alright, Roosevelt knew that the destroyers for bases deal was merely a temporary solution to Britain's shortage of cash. And in December 1940, Churchill asked Roosevelt for loans to pay for supplies and help protecting American merchant ships from German ships. Roosevelt agrees to this, basically utilizes his fireside chats to persuade the American people for support, reminding everybody that England was America's best line of defense against Germany, and if they fell, we were going to be next. He urged people to make America the arsenal of democracy and to assist England in payments for the goods. He presents Congress with a Lend-Lease bill, which would allow the president to lend, lease, or in any way dispose of war materials to any country that was considered vital to the American security. Basically, we'd lend them a bullet, and they wouldn't have to pay us for the bullet if they didn't use it. But if they used it, which they would, they'd have to pay for it. Lend-lease. But they could pay us off at a later date. And of course, the American American supporters stated, hey, send guns, not sons. And now the factories were opening up again, jobs were coming in, and Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act on March 11th, 1941. So Europe's ordering all this stuff, and we're sending all this stuff over to England, and is it getting there? Well, maybe not. Basically, German subs are destroying so much cargo and sinking so many ships that almost none of the supplies were reaching Britain. So we extend the neutrality zone to Greenland and Iceland, and by the summer of 1941, the U.S. Navy patrols of the new neutrality zone overlapped Germany's war zone. So basically, American and German ships are bound to meet. Meanwhile, the German forces are advancing into Yugoslavia, Greece, towards North Africa. Now that Hitler was able to take over Poland without worrying about Russia attacking, Hitler planned to crush the Soviets with the largest military force ever assembled along a single front. And on June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa began. And I mean, the German troops are supported by the Finnish, Hungarian, Italian, and Romanian armies. And the war along the Eastern Front opened. Few believed that the Russians would last more than 3 months. Because of this, basically, few winter supplies were taken with the troops. And the troops were able to surround Leningrad and advanced within miles of Moscow, turning away from the capture of oil fields in order to do that. Hitler basically believed that the way to conquer an enemy was to capture her cities. However, by November, things aren't looking so great. Basically, Russia's biggest ally, the winter, comes in. Let's see if I got this on the next slide. Yeah. Basically, Russia's biggest ally, the winter, comes in. And the Axis attack stalls. Stalin had cleverly moved all of his industries behind the rural mountains, so they were able to continue producing weapons. And now we make an alliance with Russia, and Roosevelt extends Lend-Lease status to them. And what really helped them out were our trucks. Then we actually started to have some losses at sea. In May of 1941, the Robin Moore became the first American merchant ship sunk to a German submarine. We increased our naval protection. And on September 4th, a U-boat fired 2 torpedoes at a destroyer, the USS Greer, both of which missed. Roosevelt decides that changes must be made to the neutrality laws so that now merchant ships could be armed. And in October, the USS Kearney was attacked and the USS Reuben James was sunk. Basically, that caused Congress to rescind all neutrality laws. And Roosevelt had met with Churchill in August to discuss the Atlantic Charter. What's the Atlantic Charter? Basically, it was a statement of American and British political goals for the post-war world. So guys, we're getting ready to go to war, and we're getting ready to go to war in Europe. Which might be one of the reasons why we weren't paying attention to the Pacific. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Pearl Harbor. Now, Japan's expansion. Guys, remember that since 1937, Japan had seized more and more amounts of Chinese coastal territory. By 1940, Roosevelt tries to put economic pressure on Japan to limit their expansion. He does this by restricting trade and forbidding the sale and shipment of aviation fuel and scrap iron. Many people see this as hypocritical, as they could still buy American oil, and was using it to extinguish all the lamps of China. The Vichy French government, gotta stop it. Okay, So, sorry about that. Had to change the battery. I was getting ready to talk about the Vichy French government. Basically, it was a government that was kind of allowed some autonomy, not really, underneath Nazi Germany. They basically ruled the southern part of France. A little bit of self-rule. Anyway, Vichy French was allowing Japanese troops to enter France's Indo-Chinese territory, and Japan had signed a defense treaty with Germany and Italy. So the U.S. began to build up its strength in the Philippines and sent long-range bombers that could threaten to set the Japanese cities afire as a deterrent. American froze all Japanese assets in July. Our talks with the Japanese ambassador were confusing and non-productive, convincing many that war with Japan was inevitable. Basically, Japan, let's see what's on the next slide. There we go. Japan wanted control over Malaysia and the Dutch East Indies, both of which had oil fields. This, however, would incur immediate reaction by the United States. So the Japanese Minister of War, Hideki Tojo, believed that he had two simple choices. They either had to submit to American will or safeguard the nation's advances and achievements by starting a war. The only way to avoid this was if the U.S. stopped aid to China, agreed to not to expand the military presence in the Pacific, and resumed full trade with Japan. If these concessions weren't met, Tojo would order military operations in the first week of December, with naval aircraft striking the Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, and the Army would invade the Philippines, Malay, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Negotiations were stalled until November 26, when Admiral Hull made it clear that the U.S. would make no concessions whatsoever and wanted Japan out of China. Well, getting ready to go to the next slide. So on that November 26th, basically the Japanese fleet under Admiral Yamamoto took part of the Japanese fleet, which included 6 aircraft carriers, towards Hawaii. And that's when we get to December 6th. Basically, American observers were observing a different part of the fleet, which was much further south. And at 7:49 a.m., December 7th, a day that will live in infamy, Japanese planes struck the American fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. By 8:12, excuse me, on Battleship Row, the fleet had kept their ships and planes close together because they were afraid of the Japanese on Hawaii. But that kind of makes it like shooting ducks in a barrel when they're all collected like that. 7 of the battleships were aflame, sinking, or badly damaged. 11 other ships were hit. 200 American aircraft were destroyed. 2,500 Americans lost their lives. Luckily, the aircraft carriers weren't in port, and Japan failed to target the important support buildings like the dry docks, the oil storage tanks, and everything like that, that would allow easier repair of the damaged ships. Now, why did Japan not attack those? Because there was a third wave where those were supposed to be attacked. Well, that's because Japan didn't want to press their luck. They were amazed at how well the attack had gone. It's kind of like if any of y'all watch Cash Cab show on cable. They always have that little video last question where they can double their money. And most people don't do it. Why? Because they don't want to push their luck. They want to take the little money they got. When I'm like, hey, you got a free cab ride across New York City. Now remember, guys, Pearl Harbor was attacked, but on that same day, they also struck Singapore, Guam, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. All of these positions were overwhelmed. Prompting Roosevelt, we're getting ready to go to the next slide, to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And on December 8th, it was passed, despite one dissenting vote, Jeannette Rankin. Now, if y'all remember, she was also the representative that voted against our involvement in World War I. So, hey, at least she's consistent, but she was the only one that voted no. And 3 days later, Germany and Italy declare war on us. So what's gonna happen? America responds to war. Well, guys, when the news of Pearl Harbor reached continental America, our isolationist fervor changed overnight. I mean, West Coast cities reported spotting Japanese planes overhead and began to practice blackouts. The Rose Bowl was moved from Pasadena to Duke Stadium in Durham, North Carolina. Stores removed items made in Japan. The FBI arrested more than 1,370 Japanese, 1,001 Germans, and 169 Italians, all within a week. And this anti-Japanese hysteria really spread fast. Y'all ready for the next slide? Which sadly resulted in Japanese-American internment. Of the 125,000 Japanese citizens living in the U.S., 3/4 were Nisei, or those who have been born in the United States. 1/4 were Issei, who were residents of Japan, who lived in the U.S. more than 18 years. The guy who was put in charge of this internment was General John DeWitt, who was head of the Western Defense District. He believed that anyone of Japanese heritage was a threat. We must worry about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the map. He was convinced espionage was underfoot, even though there was very little evidence. Now, part of the reason for this kind of scare was a lot of people blamed Japan for a revolution that had occurred down in Chile, as well as a lot of people were paranoid that they were going to damage the Panama Canal. And basically more than 110,000 Nisei and Issei were sent off to internment camps where they lost millions in property. Surrounded by barbed wire and guards, families were assigned to rooms 20 feet by 25 feet. They were assigned a cot, a straw-filled mattress. They had communal baths and eating areas, where most lived throughout the duration of the war, save those who left camps to work or volunteered for military service. And by 1943, those who passed a loyalty test could leave. And America being America, in 1988, $20,000 was reimbursed to each of the surviving internees. Which is not really what they lost, but hey, it's something. Oh, and by the way, if y'all have seen the old version of Star Trek, Mr. Sulu, on the TV show, he was one of the Japanese people that was put into these internment camps. Actually got to hear him talk about it up at the University of North Texas. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. Well, guys, this mobilizing the nation for war. Roosevelt now had to encourage Americans for war. Factories were now run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many business leaders voluntarily left their positions to go to Washington to help assist. Because, guys, we were the arsenal of the Allies. Basically, they offered incentives to spur production, like they gave low-interest loans, tax concessions, guaranteed contracts. That would be like if you owned a Jeep factory that produced 50 Jeeps a week. The government came and said, hey, we need 100 Jeeps a week, and we're going to go ahead and give you the contract, which is assuring you that money so you can go to a bank and say, hey, look, I've got these orders, the money's going to be there. You'd get a low-interest loan from them. You'd have to hire people to build on the expansion, and bada bing, bada boom, you could get it done. You ready? People at work. Basically, once again, organized labor made the deal. They wouldn't barter with companies for more pay while the war was going on. And of course, they got a pay increase for doing that. And it should come as no surprise that union membership soared. You ready? Well, because more and more men were going off to fight, they still needed workers, so they turned to the women. Indeed, by 1944, a third of the women were in the workforce, utilizing people like Rosie the Riveter down there to show, hey, that it was part of being feminist, or feminism was working in the factories. And during the war, some of the ladies had opportunities to work within the war effort. For example, you did have female pilots known as the WASPs, one unit of which were trained here in Sweetwater, Texas, that basically flew planes, not in combat, but basically flew the bombers over to Iceland and then over to Britain, as well as fighter planes. You had WACs that did clerical work and everything for the Navy. You ready? Also, guys, we needed, because we were also the breadbasket of the Allies, we needed people to grow food. And with a lot of Americans going over, who was going to work in the fields? Well, basically, we worked out a deal with Mexico. It's called the Vaquero program. Basically, that through both the American and Mexican governments hired tens of thousands of contract laborers, where they carried IDs, they paid taxes. Though this plan was basically phased out, sadly, by 1953. You start to see the rise of a Chicano culture. Kind of like here in Texas, we call somebody of Mexican heritage Tejano. if they celebrate the culture and everything like that. Out in California, it's called the Chicano, and basically that connotates politically aware Hispanic. And basically you started to have what was known as the Zoot Suit riots, because basically the young men, when they dress up to go on dances on Friday nights, they'd wear zoot suits like the gangsters did in the 20s. Well, you had American sailors that might be on leave and in port wanting to dance with the same limited resource. What's the limited resource? Girls. So you had what was known as the Zoot Suit riots break out. Also, Native Americans did play a part in the war, especially the Navajo, who were known as the code talkers, because basically nobody had ever written down the Navajo language. So you had these these Navajo Indians that were speaking Navajo to each other over the open mics, walkie-talkies, that the Japanese couldn't understand what they were saying. But the people that were talking could turn around and interpret it to the people. That was there was a film starring Nicolas Cage called Wind Talkers. That's what that one was about. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. African Americans. Of course, the wartime message, just like in World War I, was one of freedom and transformation, as once again they're moving out of rural areas in the South, heading to the productive areas of the North. Even though you did have things like the Detroit race riot break out. Ready to go to the next slide? Waging World War. Alright, in December of 1941, the U.S. had 4.1 million unemployed, 7.5 million earning a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour. Time magazine commented that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a reverse earthquake that in one terrible jerk shook everything disjointed, and askew back into place. But who were we going to attack first? Well, a lot of people wanted to attack Japan, especially the Navy. They were really pushing hard for payback. But Roosevelt felt that victory in Europe was the first priority, as Hitler was a more dangerous opponent. So we moved to a Europe first strategy. You ready? Basically, in late April 1942, the Soviet foreign minister, V.M. Molotov, arrived in Washington to ask for increased Lend-Lease supplies, the opening of a second front in the Eastern Europe to take pressure off his forces. And at that time, we didn't have the supplies necessary for a crossing across the English Channel, but Roosevelt promised more Lend-Lease supplies, and that we'd open up a second front sometime in 1942. He called this attention to Europe a grand alliance between the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Okay. Getting ready to go to the next slide. So where are we going to go? Well, we open up the African front. England knew we didn't have the supplies for a cross-channel invasion, but pushed for Operation Torch, a landing in western North Africa, where the British already had forces in western Egypt. And the head of the Joint Chiefs George C. Marshall chose Dwight David Eisenhower, a Texan, to command American forces in North Africa and Europe because of his planning and organizational abilities. So basically, he was put over everybody. Now guys, getting ready to go to the next slide. The Allied goal we knew would be a tough one. The Germans in Africa, the Africa Corps, were led by the brilliant German general Erwin Rommel, who was advancing towards Egypt in the Suez Canal. Basically, guys, he so inspired his men that most tank crews, after 5 days with the tank, they'd get 2 days off. And Erwin Rommel was pushing his troops so hard that after 14 days, their crews only got 1 day off. But they were willing to do it because he was victorious. Meanwhile, you had a renewed German offensive pushing deeper into the Soviet Union. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were organizing into wolf packs and sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate. And in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur fled the Philippines, vowing that he would return as the last American force under General Patrick Hurley surrendered. Why did we get whipped? Well, Hurley basically claimed we were outshipped, outplanned, outmanned, and outgunned by the Japanese. Getting ready to go to the next slide. By the way, I can't think of the movie. Starring Benedict Cumberbatch. About the Enigma. Anyway. What is the name of it? Anyway. Halting the Japanese advance. Basically, despite our commitment to the North African campaign, Roosevelt and military commanders decided to move against the Japanese offensive in the Pacific. The first major action occurred on May 7th, 1942, when the Navy reported a victory at the Battle of Coral Sea, where, knowing the Japanese were preparing to invade Ports Moresby, New Guinea, the aircraft carriers Lexington and Yorktown intercepted the invasion fleet and turned it back, even though it was at the loss of the Yorktown. The second part of Admiral Yamamoto's plan was to seize the American island of Midway. He had basically dispatched, there were two fleets, one that was headed to Midway, the other one that was headed up to the Aleutian Islands. And he thought that America would take that feign and try to stop that invasion. And by the way, they did invade those islands, and there was horrific fighting in the Aleutian campaign. But basically, we knew that some place A was going to, because we had broken the Japanese military code as well, and we knew that this A place was going to be attacked by the Japanese. We couldn't figure out which one it was. So someone told the commander over secret lines, they told the commander at Midway to report over the open air that his desalination plant, or his plant that turned seawater into fresh water, was broke and they needed new parts for it. And they waited by the teletype to see if the Japanese would react. And 5 minutes later, they basically said that the desalination plant was out at A. So we knew that it was Midway. and we knew they were going to attack there, but we didn't know where they were. So basically they got these scout planes, they leaned out the engines, which makes them consume less fuel, even though it makes the engines run incredibly hot. And they took off searching for the Japanese fleet. And one group of search planes was out flying, and they saw that basically they were close to the fail-safe point, which means they had to turn around and go back, otherwise they might be landing in the sea. And their commander said, no, just give me 5 more minutes. I've got a really good hunch that it's going to happen. And so he goes on 5 more minutes, and voice come over and tell him, hey, you get back. I can't believe you did that. So he starts to turn his plane, and as he's turning his plane, he catches a glimpse of metal off on the horizon. Guys, he discovered the Japanese fleet. And he gets back to the American naval vessels, where they hurry up and quickly prepare the ships to attack the Japanese. Now, what America didn't know at the time was that Japanese scouts had seen the American fleet as well. But they couldn't get the message back because the radio was broke. But as soon as they landed on the carrier, they told the admiral, and he had to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to leave on all the weapons that were live to basically do a land attack? Or am I going to put on weapons for a sea attack, try to knock out the Americans, and then go with the land attack? Well, he chose to do the sea attack, which means that when 37 dive bombers that had taken off from our aircraft carriers appeared in the skies over the Japanese aircraft carriers, there was all of this live munitions on the decks, which just made it like throwing match into a vat of gasoline. The 37 dive bombers caused a devastating fire. You had 3 carriers sunk immediately, with a 4th sinking later in the battle. Now on this one, the Yorktown the Lexington was sunk, but the carriers and air superiority of the Japanese is destroyed and would never be regained for the remainder of the war. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Basically, Nimitz begins an island hopping campaign, seizing the atolls on the Solomon, Marshall, and Gilbert and Mariana Island groups, approaching the Philippines from the east. On May 7th, on August 7th, 1942, the 1st Marine Division moved to Guadalcanal Island in the Solomons, which was considered a fork in the road towards victory, and both sides fought furiously. And after months of heavy fighting, basically Japan withdrew the last of its forces in early February 1943, and slowly turned, and basically the tide of war slowly turned against Japan in its most important area, resupply. The Japanese Naval General Staff after the war said the main cause of our setback was our inability to increase our forces with the same speed as you did. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. was able to launch 14 new assault carriers. Japan, they were only able to launch 6. The tide turns in Europe. By late 1942, American forces were turning back Rommel's Afrika Korps, halting his advance at El Alamein, where British General Bernard Montgomery drove him out of Egypt and west towards Tunisia. Meanwhile, American forces had begun Operation Torch and landing in Algeria and Morocco. They began pushing west after initially facing a defeat, but then General George Patton was put into command. And the American forces are able to push through and meet with Montgomery. Caught between these two forces, the German forces surrender in May 13th, 1943. But much to Patton's chagrin, Rommel had actually been flown back to Germany because Adolf Hitler didn't want to lose him. And he was given the important job of building up the defensive Atlantic Wall so that the Allies couldn't invade. Ready? Next slide. Basically, in Russia there was fierce fighting. In the summer and fall of 1942, German armies had advanced slowly, but in the winter the Russians drove them from the oil fields and trapped them at Stalingrad. And on February 2nd, 1943, in the dead of winter, out of supplies and taking heavy losses, 300,000 Germans of the 6th Army surrendered, as they had already lost more than 140,000 men. The tide of the Russian front had turned, and over the next 2 years, the Soviets began to win their land back in their drive towards Berlin. So what is Britain and America going to do? Well, after the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin pushed really hard for the opening of an Allied front in Europe. And after meeting with Churchill, Roosevelt agrees to attack the soft underbelly of the Axis forces, Sicily and Italy, in what was called Operation Husky. Basically, this was an invasion of Sicily, which took place in early July, and within a month, the Allies held the island. In Italy, Mussolini was captured by partisans, and they put in a new leader, Pietro Bobbio, and he immediately began negotiations with Britain and the U.S. for peace. And Italy surrendered to us on September 8th, hours after the U.S. forces landed at Salerno. But the Germans can't have that happen, so they began Operation Avalanche, where basically super James Bond stuff, they are able to land excuse me, they're able to land a glider on a mountaintop and basically unload these guys, free Mussolini, and move their armies into the hills and be able to defend themselves very well. So much so that the advance just north of Salerno, the American advance, was halted, and it's not until May of 1944 that the Allies were able to break through. And on June 4th, Rome was liberated. Next slide. Well, we can see that the Allies are making advances, and Nazis are slowly getting smaller and weaker. And we have the Tehran Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met on November 27th through December 1st of 1943 to discuss strategy and the post-war world. The Soviets agreed to help us in Japan and to win a world organization and to join a world organization after the war. We agreed to launch a new attack on the French coast, because now we had the supplies. And guys, that is the beginning of Operation Overlord, which is the greatest amphibious assault ever assembled. Had more than 6,483 ships, 1,500 tanks, 200,000 men, all against the German troops that were behind the defensive Atlantic Wall. They launched the attack on D-Day, which was June 6, 1944. And Eisenhower, who was put in charge of figuring this whole thing out, wrote 2 different letters. One letter was thanks for the troops if they were victorious, and wow, what a great victory they had. The other letter was a letter saying, I blame myself totally. I let everybody down. It was my fault that it didn't succeed. And the reason why we had to attack on June 6th is because June 5th was Rommel's wife's birthday. And she was in Berlin. And so basically, being a good husband, he'd flown back to Berlin to be with his wife. Well, this early in the morning, when our attack is launched, there's nobody to tell, like tank units that are 30 minutes away, hey, move up to the front, because Adolf Hitler said nobody could do that they'd have to basically call him and get permission from him. Because they thought that basically the Germans were attacking much further north. And there's a real cool story about that, about a guy who had died of tuberculosis. So there was water in his lungs that made it look like he drowned. So really quick they put false maps with the invasion plans on him, put him on, dressed him up in a British military uniform or an RAF uniform, the Royal Air Force, and put his body on a submarine, sped that submarine off the coast of France, surfaced, dumped his body overboard, believing that Franco would give the information to Hitler, which he did, which fooled Hitler into believing that the attack was going to take place much further north. And also, nobody wanted to wake up Adolf Hitler in the middle of the morning. And guys, a movie that did an excellent job of portraying this is Saving Private Ryan. Like when they finally do go back to World War II, that 15 minutes, even veterans of the assault said that it was so much like the actual experience. Anyway, what? On June 6, 1944, American and British forces land on Normandy, and the fighting on Omaha Beach was the fiercest, where the American 1st Division faced heavy losses, and after a few weeks, they were able to begin pushing inland while utilizing our air superiority to begin bombing the Reich. You ready to see that? And in one of the worst bombings ever, the firebombing of Dresden, a firestorm was created that killed more than 135,000 civilians, with a total of 600,000 German civilians dying in air attacks and more than 800,000 wounded. Because that's kind of war. By the way, Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s book, Slaughterhouse 5, takes place in the firebombing of Dresden. Y'all ready for the next slide? Alright, stresses within the Grand Alliance. Guys, stresses were evident at the Yalta Conference meeting. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, they all agreed to a divided Germany after the war. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted elected governments in Eastern Europe, but Stalin is like, he ain't gonna let that happen. And by this time, basically, Roosevelt is old, tired. He hoped that America's goodwill could hold off Stalin in Europe and Asia. But Churchill leaves incredibly worried. You all ready? Next slide. Basically, Hitler does try to make one last grasp for glory at the Battle of the Bulge, which basically would have split British and American forces. He was able to push up and envelop one army, and he was told to surrender, to which the general gave the reply, nuts. And that's kind of famous. But one of the groups that was captured there, the Americans wouldn't reveal what their religion was, because they did have some Jews in the unit. So basically the Germans threw them all into a concentration camp. There's an interesting documentary called Berga about that, B-E-R-G-A. On March 7th, 1945, we crossed the Rhine River. The Russians, they're basically involved in house-to-house fighting in Berlin. And so on April 30th, Adolf Hitler commits suicide by biting into a cyanide pill. Well, first he gave his dog Blondie a cyanide pill. It killed the dog. He'd gotten married earlier that day. His wife, Eva Braun, she killed herself. Then he basically had the cyanide pill in his mouth and a gun up to his head, bit into the pill and shot the gun at the same time. Basically, they take his body out behind the Reichschancellery and throw what little remaining gas they have on top of it and set it on fire. The movie Downfall is about the last days of the Reich, even though it starts out when, you know, everything's okay, but that's only like 10 minutes long. The rest of the movie is like the last 8 days of the Reich. And on May 8th, Germany surrenders. But Roosevelt didn't know about it because he died on April 12th of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. As we're invading into Europe, basically the Holocaust was discovered. Part of Adolf Hitler's final solution. Getting ready to go to the next slide. In which more than 6 million Jews were killed. And guys, it did happen. Not only do we have photographic evidence, but also we have the files of the Germans themselves, who are meticulous about keeping records. Alright, ready to go to the next slide? Closing the circle on Japan. Basically, Japan wanted to force America to invade a seemingly endless number of small islands at such a high cost while they could build up their strength. You had like Tarawa, where the Marines landed on November 21st, 1943, against 5,000 well-entrenched Japanese who fought to the death. The U.S. suffered 3,000 casualties. And by July of 1944, we had a number of islands like Guam, Saipan, Tinian back in American hands, and long-range bombing of Japan could take place. Ready to go to the next slide? At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we destroy the remaining Japanese Navy. The Philippines get retaken on October 23rd. The whole Pacific offensive bore down on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, both of which were 750 miles from Tokyo, and helped defend against this American attack. Japan utilizes kamikaze pilots. Basically, they took that word kamikaze, which means divine wind, from way back when the Mongols were going to invade Japan from China and basically conquer it. They vastly outnumbered the Japanese. Indeed, they had a whole fleet and everything like that, but they launched their attack during typhoon season. A kamikaze, or divine wind, rises up and wipes out the invading fleet. This kind of gave the whole deal about, hey, we're going to fight off the invaders with our kamikaze pilots, which were basically planes that were so laden down with bombs, they were flying bombs. Kind of like cruise missiles guided by people. Anyway, they were terribly... these kamikaze attacks, at first they shocked our Navy, but then after that, they kind of got used to it and knew they had to shoot without mercy. Next slide. On most of the kamikaze pilots, by this time, they're just kids that don't really have a lot of training. The only training they get is how to take off and how to aim the plane so you can fly it into the ships. Basically, at Iwo Jima, it's terribly bloody. Virtually all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders fought to the death. In the U.S., basically we had 6,821 killed and 20,000 wounded. Okinawa was even worse, with 900 Japanese planes attacking us, 300 of which were kamikaze. We win by June, but at the cost of 12,000 Americans, 110,000 Japanese soldiers, and 160,000 civilians. Basically, the civilians, you had like Japanese moms that were clutching their kids and running off of cliffs, hurtling to a death below because they were afraid of what the Americans would do to them. This is even though you had translators telling people, hey, stop it, don't do it, don't do it. So guys, that kind of shows you what may have happened had we had to attack the mainland. Ready for the next slide? And basically, that's why, not only to save American lives, but also to save Japanese lives, we have the Enola Gay, which took off from Tinian and dropped the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima at 9:15 in the morning on August 6th. Now, how do we know that it happened at 9:15? Because, guys, that's what the hands of the town clock are frozen to, in perpetuity. Basically, it was Japan's 8th largest city, had a total population of $250,000 people. Almost 100,000 of which were killed in the fireball. Now, one of the reasons why we attacked it, remember, this is the first atomic bomb that was ever used in a war. This city hadn't really been touched, and because of the valley that it was in, it kind of was a way that contained all of the explosion. And of course, Japan was totally freaked out by this. They had no idea what had happened. And because they delayed, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki with 60,000 killed. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Which made the Japanese emperor, Hirohito, supposedly this divine emperor, he had to bear the unbearable. And on August 14th, 1945, he surrendered. And of course, what a lot of people don't know is that there was a coup by the military that didn't want that record to get out because they wanted to fight to the end. And the guy who basically had recorded the record had hid it so well that they couldn't find where the record was, and that's when people who were loyal to the emperor were able to come back and regain control from this militaristic group. And guys, that's World War II. Alright, I'll put up that quiz review for you, and there we go.